The book of Daniel may be divided into two halves of 6 chapters each. The first 6 chapters deal with Daniel and the Hebrew boys in competition with the astrologers and the wise men of Babylon. But now, here in chapter 7, we begin the second half of the book of Daniel, which is apocalyptic literature. Visionary prophecy that's very encrypted, oftentimes in symbols, and oftentimes there is a need for a heavenly messenger to help the prophet interpret. And this second half, as apocalyptic usually is composed of visions which show God conquering the nations and their sovereignties. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground, and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold, another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Before we begin our analysis, I want to briefly point out to you a structural feature that some commentators have noted, how in chapter 2 you have a statue in a dream. And then in the very next chapter, you have a real statue that Nebuchadnezzar erects to be worshipped. And then in chapter 5, you have Belshazzar falling, the kingdom of Babylon falling because of the blasphemy of the king. And then we will reverse this order. In chapter 6, we had real animals, the lion's den. And now here we are in chapter 7, in a dream and a vision, and we have animals again. And so it is very much like Hebrew literature to have these types of parallelisms, and they help us to identify a sort of structure and a sort of pattern in the book of Daniel. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream. Now it's interesting that we have Belshazzar mentioned in the very first verse to set the tone. And the tone is going to be adversarial. We know this is going to be the story of King Yahweh versus the kings of the nations. Because if you recall, the first 5 chapters were interesting because the first 4 were for Nebuchadnezzar, a king who was misguided but was ultimately teachable. Well, Belshazzar, the final king of Babylon, he only got 1 chapter because he was not teachable. He desecrated the instruments of Yahweh from the temple, and he was disrespectful toward Daniel, and he directly received a death sentence. That's what the writing on the wall was about. I refer you to the video on chapter 5 if you didn't see it. So to have him mentioned here in the very first verse sets a sort of an adversarial tone where we know that God is going to prevail in his war against national sovereignties. Now, Golden Gate points out the significance of the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, which would be in 550 or 549 BC, because that was the year that Cyrus the Persian defeated his Median overlords. So in other words, the process that ultimately led to the demise of Babylonia as the center of human power begun in this year. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heaven were stirring up the great sea. God's war against the sea is a great theme throughout biblical literature. The sea, or the monster in it, oftentimes personify forces of evil and chaos. And I just want to give you some examples here. In the Psalm 18, the valleys of the sea were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare at your rebuke, Lord, at the blast of breath from your nostrils. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes all the rivers run dry. And so sometimes Yahweh uh, directly attacks the sea, but sometimes it's the monster in the sea, as in Isaiah. In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, great, and powerful sword, Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. And in Job, by his power he churned up the sea. By his wisdom he cut Rahab to pieces. By his breath the skies became fair. His hand pierced the gliding serpent. And so you have, four examples here: two of God taking on the sea, and two of God taking on the monster that lives in the sea. So it's no wonder why when you get to Revelation chapter 21, it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea." The point here is not that God hates large bodies of water, or that there literally won't be any large bodies of water in the world to come. The point is that the sea, especially in apocalyptic, but not just in apocalyptic, throughout the Bible, the sea has taken on this connotation of chaos, of evil, of decreational forces, and sometimes it's taken on a demonic vibe to it, a demonic character. Think of Jesus casting the demons out of the swine, and then they immediately run into the sea. And four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. Many scholars posit that there is a relationship between the four beasts here and this passage in Hosea, and you'll see why as I read it. "I cared for you in the wilderness," this is God speaking to Israel, "in the land of drought. As they had their pasture, they became satisfied, and being satisfied, their heart became proud. Therefore they forgot me. So I will be like a lion to them." Now our first beast here is a lion. "Like a leopard, I will lie down in wait by the wayside." Now, the leopard is the third animal that's going to mention here in Daniel. And the second one is the bear. "I will encounter them like a bear robbed of her cubs, and I will tear open their chests. There I will also devour them like a lioness, as a wild beast would tear them." And so some have suggested, well, your lion, your leopard, your bear, they all come from this passage, and a wild beast may be the fourth and mysterious beast with 10 horns here. This is interesting because it suggests that, one, these beasts only come to ravish Israel because God allows them to do so. And two, it's also interesting because these different beasts here, as we'll see in this chapter, do in fact harm God's people, as the four animals do in this passage in Hosea. Another important passage to keep in mind here is Genesis chapter 1. "And God said, Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to its kind. And it was so." Now, when it says let them be according to their own kind, this is a way of saying that they ought not to mix, that there should be order and there should be categories in creation, that the animals should not be mixed together. And so, again, we see that this is a decreational picture, a picture of chaotic and evil elements challenging God's sovereignty over creation, because two of our animals here are hybrids. It's also a violation of the basic principles that underlie the law of Moses. "Keep my decrees. Do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with two kinds of seeds. Do not wear clothing woven of two kinds of material." It was a sign of sacred space that you should have mixed animals, because the cherubim that were in the temple or in the tabernacle, they indicate sacred space. But when you're in common space, when you're out in the field or when you're dealing with your animals on the farm, animals should not be mixed together. That is a very special thing that represents the sacred space, the space where Yahweh dwells. And this was not supposed to occur anywhere else outside of God's immediate presence. But here we have a sort of a blasphemy, a sort of a sacrilegious picture here, as these evil and rebellious nations are characterized as mixed animals. As we move throughout Daniel chapter 7, we will be apt to note the places where this chapter has had such a huge and significant impact on the book of Revelation. Now, our four beasts here in the book of Daniel are separate, but in Revelation, they all get combined into a single beast. And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. Now, one of the mistakes that interpreters of Revelation oftentimes make is that they think the symbols there are temporally restricted, that this beast represents one empire that may have existed in the first century, or a beast that will exist at the end of history, but this is not the case. Revelation, and especially this section of Revelation, chapters 11 through 13, is full of transhistorical symbols, symbols that represent phenomena and entities that will exist throughout history. I'll give you an example of this. The woman clothed in the sun, she represents Israel up until the time of Christ, and she represents Israel continued in the form of the church after Christ all the way to the second coming. She is a transhistorical symbol. She exists not in the final 7-year tribulation or just in the first century in the time of John. She represents something that exists throughout history. The same thing with this beast, right? The beast in Revelation 13 is the child of Satan, is the child of the dragon who summons it out of the sea. And you don't want to make the mistake of thinking the beast in Revelation 13 is just one beast that's coming at the end. That's why it has all of these other animal characteristics combined into a single beast. In other words, in Daniel 7, we have 4 different empires that follow one another. In Revelation 13, the reason they're all combined into a single beast is to let us know that whoever the political entity is who persecutes God's people, it doesn't matter if it's Persia, if it's Babylon, if it's ISIS, if it's the Soviet Empire, whoever persecutes the church is a manifestation of the beast in any age. Satan always has his political seed, and it always takes on different forms, different governments, different armies, whoever it is. There's always someone around to persecute the church, and that political manifestation is the child of Satan. That is the beast of Revelation 13 throughout history, all the way up until the time of the second coming. Now, if you want a more detailed analysis of how the beast imagery works in the book of Revelation, I refer you to my playlist on the book of Revelation, where I go all the way through Revelation, verse by verse. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. Now, it's pretty clear that the lion with eagle's wings represents Babylonia, because these symbols are used elsewhere in the Old Testament to represent Babylon. For example, Jeremiah chapter 4. A lion has come out of his lair, a destroyer of nations has set out, he has left his place to lay waste your land. Your towns will lie in ruins without inhabitant. That is, Jeremiah, speaking on behalf of the Lord, is threatening the land of Judah, that Babylon is coming. So in Jeremiah, a lion represents Babylonia, but now look at Ezekiel. Thus says the Lord God, a great eagle with great wings and long pinions, rich in plumage and of many colors, is coming. And then he goes on, and 5 or 6 verses later, he interprets it. He says, "Say now to the rebellious house, do you not know what these things mean? Tell them, behold, the king of Babylon came to Jerusalem and took her king and her princes and brought them to him to Babylon." So a lion in Jeremiah, an eagle in Ezekiel, we have them both combined here in Daniel to represent Babylonia. Now, it's interesting that it says uh, the wings are plucked off, it stands up, and it's given the heart of a man. Are the plucking of the wings and the reception of a human heart an act of judgment or a promotion? Is this a good change for the beast, or is it a negative change? Now, many will agree with Pace. She says some see the plucking of the wings as a degradation of the empire's strength and ferocity. The plucking of its wings is an obvious reference to its diminishment. In addition, this beast must stand on its hind legs, indicating that it must fight. But at the very moment it needs the most strength, a mere human heart is given to it. Now, some will agree with her. I do not think this. I do not think that it's bad for the beast that this happens. I think this is a positive thing, and so we need a different point of view. Nebuchadnezzar's restoration earlier in Daniel chapter 4 is ultimately going to be the better point of reference here. Remember what it says in Daniel chapter 4, and notice how some of the animal language is the same as here in Daniel 7. Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like bird's claws. At the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me. So this is a good thing, right? He was like an animal, and then he was given his reasoning capacities as a man. Now, keep in mind, in Daniel chapter 7, these beasts do not just represent empires collectively, they also represent their individual kings. We know this from these two passages here, Daniel 7:17 and also verse 23. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. And thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth. And so we know that they're both kings and kingdoms. And so this first one, this lion with eagle's wings, this represents Nebuchadnezzar, but it also represents Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom of Babylonia. And being given the heart of the man, standing up on 2 feet, the wings being plucked, etc. This is a symbolic recapitulation of the narrative in Daniel chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar's sanity is restored to him. So it's a good thing, not a bad thing. Now, there is a ministry out of Dallas, Texas, End Time Ministry with Irvin Baxter, which suggests that here in the book of Daniel, we have the American Revolution being predicted. Now, one of the reasons is because this is Daniel chapter 7 and verse 4. Well, the American Revolution took place on the 7th month of July, the 4th day, right? July 4th. And so that's just an ancillary reason. The primary reason I will discuss here in just a moment. But there are many who have followed this idea, who have followed this teaching out of end time ministry, that right here in the book of Daniel, we have the prediction of America turning against its British overlords and establishing its own sovereignty. According to Irvin Baxter of End Time Ministries, the eagle's wings here are plucked off of the lion, right? And then the lion is gone out of the scene, and the eagle's wings are attached to a man who's standing on 2 feet. Well, since an eagle represents the United States of America and a lion represents Great Britain, when you get the eagle's wings coming off of the lion, uh, Irvin Baxter will tell you this is the American Revolution. This is the United States coming out of Great Britain. However, a little bit of acquaintance with the Aramaic language will disallow him from picturing it this way. Again, he thinks the eagle's wings are coming off the lion and then being placed on a man. That is not so. What is happening here is eagle's wings are coming off of the lion, and then the eagle's wings are gone. Right? There's no focus on the eagle beyond that point. The wings are gone, and then the focus is on the lion, which stands up like a man. And we know this because of the use of masculine and feminine language here. The word lion, which I have here in blue, lion is feminine. Now we know it's feminine because it ends with this letter right here. Right? This indicates femininity. So lion right here. And the eagle is masculine, so it has no extra ending. It just has these three letters, no extra ending. And so if you were to read this in an interlinear Bible, it would say, the first like lion and wings of eagle to her, right? A lion had the wings of an eagle. Watching I was until that they were torn off wings of her, and she was lifted from the ground, and on 2 feet like a man she stood. Right? Now that's important because he thinks the wings are coming off the lion and then being put on the back of a man. Uncle Sam, he will tell you. He thinks this is about America. However, it's the original lion that is standing. Right? The lion did not go away. The lion is standing. It simply lost its wings. And the heart of a man was given to her. That is, this lion was given the heart of a man. And so this is not the wings being transplanted onto a man who represents the United States of America. I regard that as a very silly interpretation. And there are many people who will try very hard to find the United States in the Bible, and they're always looking for the United States to show up in some sort of a passage that would make the United States look heroic. Now, this is just patriotism corrupting the reason in the good sense of biblical interpreters. You don't want to do this sort of thing. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise and devour much flesh. Now, it's easy to see that the lion with eagle's wings represents Babylonia, but the bear is a much more complicated matter, and this is where interpreters will divide. Some will say this is Media, and then Persia is in the 3rd position, and then others will say that Media and Persia should be combined into position number 2, and then that would make Greece number 3. So we're going to look at both views, the strengths and weaknesses of both perspectives. And so first we want to look at it by taking Media separately, Media as its own empire. Now some will take issue with Media being after Babylon here in the sequence, Babylon being the lion and Media being the bear. And the reason why is because historically Babylonia and Media were contemporaneous kingdoms, right? If they're contemporaneous, then what sense does it make to put Media in a position after Babylon? If they are not historically sequential, why should they be sequential here in the chapter? Well, I discussed this at more length in chapter 2. I would refer you to that video, but all I will say at this point is that those who defend this perspective, that Media is the bear, they will point out that Babylon was on its way down when Media reached the height of its power. So they are contemporaneous. However, the shift of power in this region does shift from Babylon to Media. Media comes into its heyday after Babylon. Now, many will be critical of the notion that Media and Persia would be separated in the sequence here, that Media would be in position 2 and Persia in position 3, because throughout the book of Daniel, usually these two are combined together. You have references to the laws of the Medes and the Persians. You have Belshazzar's kingdom in Daniel 5 falls and it's given to the Medes and the Persians. And so why would you get here and they be separated? Well, first of all, we need to recognize that in the ancient world, when you put kingdoms in a list like this, in a sequence, oftentimes these two were divided. Herodotus refers to the sequence of Assyria, Media, and Persia. Herodotus is, of course, a Greek historian. In the Sibylline Oracles, and this is important because this is a Jewish document, a Jewish schematization of history. We have Assyria, Media, Persia, Macedonia. Again, we see that Media and Persia were listed separately. And then also another document has Assyria, Media, Persia, and Macedonia. So there are a number of places in the ancient world where there's a sequencing going on of empires, and they are held separately. Also, it matches Daniel 2, which says the second empire was inferior to the first. Now, here in Daniel chapter 7, it doesn't explicitly say that the second beast is inferior to the first beast. However, it is interesting. Our biggest compliments here go to beast number 1 and beast number 3. Right? So the lion with eagle's wings, he's the beast, he's the first beast. But he stands up on his hind legs, and he's given the heart of a man, etc. That's a compliment, as we discussed a few moments ago. The third beast, the leopard, is the one who is given dominion. And so the first and third beasts get the biggest compliments here. And the second and the fourth beast, not so much. The fourth one is a complicated story. But your biggest compliments go to the first and the third beast. Well, this matches the statute back in Daniel chapter 2, where the first and the third sections of the statute were the greatest. And if that means we are to compare Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, well, in Daniel 2, Media was its own separate entity in position number 2. And so it would make sense that it would be that way here. Again, I refer you to the video on Daniel chapter 2, where this is discussed in more detail. So if it is Media being taken as a separate entity from Persia, who's represented by the three ribs? Well, some will say you go to Jeremiah, where you have Ararat and Mini and Ashkenaz listed as Media's three allies as they go against Babylon. So the three ribs in the bear's mouth could represent Media coaxing its allies into helping it at the time of war. Now, Walton claims that they represent Urartu, which was subdued by the Medes in 605, Menaea, an ally of Assyria, in its final days, which fell to the Medes shortly after the collapse of Assyria, and the Scythians. So this is, just a couple examples of speculations. There are other ones, but nevertheless, many different ideas have been proposed as to who the three ribs could represent, usually understood to represent three smaller nations that either fall to Media or are at the beck and call of Media when they go against their enemies. Now it says the bear is raised up on one side. Now many interpreters will not take this to mean that it's leaning toward the left or toward the right. They will take it to mean that the bear is leaning backwards up on its back legs like it's about to strike. If that's the case, it could just be a commentary on how fierce Media could be in combat. Finally, the strongest evidence that Media is the bear is not the description of the bear itself, but because we have these other fundamental reference points. That is, we know that the lion represents Babylonia, and the fourth beast is going to sound a whole lot like Greece. Right? So if we know the list begins with Babylonia, and we know it terminates with Greece, we'll talk about that in a moment, then we need two nations to fit in the middle. And the only way to do that is to separate Media and Persia, to put Media in position number 2 and Persia in position number 3. In this way, the list could culminate with Greece. And this is one of the major reasons why many accept this sequencing of empires here. Now let's consider the alternative perspective, that the bear represents the Medo-Persian Empire, that the Medes and the Persians are not held separately in the sequence, but that they're combined into a single position. This would make Greece position number 3, and the Seleucid Greek Empire would be position number 4, or else it would be the Roman Empire. Right? So let's consider some reasons why the second beast may be Medo-Persia? Well, most obviously, you have a number of places in Daniel that refer to the laws of the Medes and the Persians as though they're a single entity. And then again, Belshazzar's kingdom was given to the Medes and the Persians as though they were a single entity. And so, using other places in the book of Daniel, many will make their case. Now, it says that the bear is lifted up on one side. Now, this is interesting because the Medo-Persian Empire is discussed with very similar language later on in Daniel chapter 8, where it says, "Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram that had two horns. And now the two horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last." Now, that's interesting. When he interprets it, he says, "The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia." And so you have a ram who has horns, and there's not a balance here. One horn is longer than the other. Well, the bear lifted up on one side could be another symbolic way of referring to this same feature of the Medes and the Persians joined together, with the Persians becoming superior to the Medes. Now, again, this would not match Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 2, again, Media is held as separate from Persia. These dream visions do not combine these empires because dream visions are concerned, unlike the rest of the book of Daniel, dream visions are concerned with the birth and the destiny of nations. And since there was a time when Media was separate from Persia, dream visions discuss Media as separate from Persia, even though in the rest of the book of Daniel, when we're not in dream versions, Media and Persia will be combined because that's the way that they were in Daniel's day. After Babylon fell to the Persians, the Medes and the Persians were a united entity. But in these dream visions, we're looking at the birth and the destiny of a nation. And there was a time when the Medes were not a part of the Persian Empire. Again, I refer you to my video on Daniel chapter 2. But the point is here, most interpreters will agree that Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 have to line up. The beasts have to line up with the different sections of the statue there in Daniel chapter 2. And since the Medes and the Persians were not combined into a single entity in chapter 2, most likely they're not being combined here. Now let's move on to the third position. Again, we'll look at it both ways. Let's look at it as though Babylonia is first, Media is second, and then third is Persia being held in distinction to the Medes. After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. Now, the 4 heads and the 4 wings could represent universality. Here's a good example of this. Daniel said, "I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea." And we find this oftentimes in the book of Revelation, that 4 is used to represent either all nations of people or used to represent all of creation. And so that may be why you have 4 used in reference to this beast, just because it had such a universal dominion. And if that point is being made of Persia, it makes a lot of sense. The third kingdom in Daniel chapter 2 was said to rule over all the earth. So again, it looks like we're lining up with Daniel chapter 2. And if that's the case, Persia is definitely the third section on the statue in that chapter. And so they would need to be the third beast here as well. Now, the 4 heads is interesting because we do specifically have 4 kings of Persia referenced later on in the book of Daniel, where it will say, "In the first year of Darius the Mede, I arose to be an encouragement and a protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them." And so just using the context of the book of Daniel itself, we do specifically have 4 kings mentioned in reference to Persia, and now we have a beast with 4 heads and 4 wings, and so that could correspond to these 4 kings of Persia. Now let's consider the other perspective. We know it begins with Babylonia as the lion, but let's say the bear represents the Medo-Persian Empire. Well, then that would mean the leopard here in position number 3 would have to be Greece. And this same point could apply about universality, that the 4 heads and the 4 wings represent universality, because Alexander the Great conquered most of the known world very quickly in the span of a decade. And so this could fit with him just as well as it could have fit with the Persians. Also, it's interesting, 4 heads or 4 wings could be a reference to the 4 Diadochi. The kingdom of Alexander the Great, upon his death, was divided and left to his generals. And famously, it became 4 entities, and here you can see them on the map. So it could potentially be a reference to the schisms that took place after he died. Now, another thing to consider is that the leopard's notable speed could be compared with what is said of Alexander elsewhere in the book of Daniel. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. Now, that is a commentary in chapter 8, as we'll see, on Alexander the Great and how fast he moved, expanding the empire. And so that would correspond pretty well with a leopard that moves so quickly because it has wings. And so there you have it. We've considered both possible concoctions here that it goes Babylonia, then Media, then Persia for these first 3 animals. And also now we've considered Babylonia, and then Medo-Persia, and then Greece. So one of these perspectives is right. And really, to know which one to choose, you have to consider the rest of the data in this chapter, which we will do in the next video.